Hey Dave.
Hey.
So did you fire Finbar?
Wasn't working out for us. Have to agree with that one.
Yeah. What are we drinking, man?
This week we're drinking one of my favourite ciders by Custard & Co. over Western Australia. It's a vintage dry, so think English style. Cloudy, not so much bubbles. Gets you really drunk.
Drink responsibly.
I do. Cheers, guys.
Cheers.
And back to you, what's happening this week?
Well, so a couple of weeks ago we talked about Bronwyn Bishop's taxpayer-funded helicopter ride from Melbourne to Geelong, and it really blew up in her face last weekend. She actually stepped down as Speaker, but she's not the only politician who's got herself in hot water over expenses.
A whole heap of politicians have got in trouble this week, including Tony Burke, who flew his family business class to Uluru, Christopher Pyne, who flew his children business class to Canberra, Philip Ruddock, who flew himself and his wife to Queensland to see their investment property, again business class, and Joe Hockey, who chartered an $11,000 flight in Tasmania to schmooze with a senator.
So this whole expenses-wrought scandal has really united Labor and the Libs in a nice show of bipartisanship. It's turned into Parliament versus the people, because there's a whole lot of voters out there who think that politicians are taking taxpayers for a ride.
We also saw the Trans-Pacific Partnership talks stall over the weekend after the countries involved couldn't come to a deal between sugar, dairy and pharmaceuticals, to name a few.
We're not really sure whether the world leaders in Hawaii were watching politics in the Belleville last weekend, but you never know. They've pushed the talks back to November, you know, could be bowing to political pressure from me and Brendan.
Confirmed. So the big news this week has been the release of the Productivity Commission's report. Can you tell me about the Productivity Commission?
Yeah, so the Productivity Commission is an independent body designed to advise the government on lots of different policy areas. So basically, it writes recommendations that it passes on to government, and the government can either make it into law in Parliament or it can chuck the whole lot in the bin.
Now, the report that was filed earlier this week is called the Workplace Reform Report. It's really important for employees and bosses because it kind of governs the way they interact in the workplace.
One of the big recommendations in this report was getting rid of Sunday penalty rates. So what that means is if you're working as a casual in retail or in hospo, on Sundays you'll get paid your Saturday extra wage. And I actually think this makes sense. For me, I don't go to church. I think Sundays are equal to Saturdays in terms of weekend days. And I do know that you should get paid more just because you're working on a Sunday and forfeiting your right to go to church. But it does suck if you're a retail or a hospo employee, because at the end of that Sunday shift, you are walking home with less money in your pocket.
Another thing that was addressed in the Commission's report was the minimum wage. Now, there's been concern from small business, which I think is reasonable, that says that it's hard to make a profit when you've got to pay the minimum wage. For instance, if I ran a small cafe and I wanted to open on a Sunday, I'd have to pay a casual employee $32 an hour. Now that might mean that I just can't afford to open on Sunday, so they don't get a job and I don't get any profit either. So small businesses are saying, well, maybe I should pay my employees a little bit less and give them a day's work, and I might be able to open for the day.
But the Productivity Commission has actually said that no, that's not true, and the minimum wage does not cause unemployment. And I think it's important to say that the Productivity Commission thinks we should be paid a wage that we can live off, which is really important, and good on you, Productivity Commission.
Another aspect of the report was changes to the Fair Work Commission.
Yeah, so the Fair Work Commission is an independent body that workers can go to if they feel like they're being exploited at work. So it basically settles disputes between employees and bosses. But the Productivity Commission wants to see some changes to the way we appoint people to the Fair Work Commission. So what it wants is every 5 years, state and territory governments would have the opportunity to appoint a short list of people, which would then get the final tick of approval from the Federal Employment Minister.
Now, while it might sound good that there's fresh faces coming into the Fair Work Commission every 5 years, it does pose a problem because it could effectively mean that the government of the day has the ability to stack the commission with their mates. So for instance, if it was a Labor government in power, they might choose to stack it with union officials. And if it was a Liberal government, they might stack it with big businesses, which might change the outcomes of the dispute settlements, which to lean towards the government of the day's perspective. So this week, Holly's tweeted us asking what is an enterprise contract?
So an enterprise contract, this has come up in the Productivity Commission report, and an enterprise contract is a new model of workplace agreement, basically setting out rights and responsibilities between workers and bosses in the workplace. So basically this new model sits between two things we've had in Australia for a little while. So one's called an individual agreement and the other one's called enterprise bargaining.
Now, an enterprise bargaining agreement is where you and everyone you work with negotiates directly with your boss about your pay and conditions. So that means that everyone in a workplace who's doing the same job should be getting paid the same wage and working under the same conditions. So the theory is no one gets left behind.
So on the other end of the spectrum, we've got these things called individual agreements, and that's basically where you get a single worker talking one-on-one with your boss about different flexible work arrangements. And what this means is you can say, hey, I'm willing to take a cut from the award wage if you let me knock off an hour early so I can pick up my kids from school.
Now, individual agreements are kind of like the descendants of John Howard's work choices, which was a really controversial policy that pretty much lost in the 2007 election.
Yeah, so back to this new model, the enterprise contract, and what it means is that employers would be able to trade off award conditions for increased flexibility, so that might mean different rosters or whatever, but it applies to a whole class of employees and they don't have to talk to each person individually. And the Productivity Commission thinks that this can be good for everyone, but it is really controversial because what it means is that your boss can basically write up a contract without talking to you and say, here, sign it or piss off.
Whatever happens, the government's going to tread really lightly with this. They've said they're not going to change industrial relations laws unless it goes to an election. And really, since work choices, it hasn't been their strong suit. That's all from us this week. Check us out on Facebook and Twitter.
And you can hit us up if you've got any questions you want answered. I'm Harriet.
I'm Brendan.
See you next week for Politics at the Belleville. Okay.